In the summer of 1942, the USS Grunion moved through the cold expanse of the North Pacific toward the Aleutian chain, where fog, shifting currents, and submerged volcanic ridges created a region that often erased the boundaries between what was detected and what was imagined. Within this stretch of ocean, even routine patrol movements could vanish into uncertainty, leaving only fragmented traces in naval records and delayed communications that struggled to keep pace with what was actually unfolding at sea. You're about to follow the trail of a submarine whose final recorded message entered command systems in a form that could not be immediately understood, and whose disappearance forced investigators to rely on incomplete signals, environmental reconstruction, and decades later discoveries beneath the ocean floor. What emerges is not a clear account of loss, but a layered sequence of uncertainty shaped by war, silence, and the limits of interpretation itself. Steel commissioned into a war already expanding beneath the surface. Even as the Second World War unfolded across continents and oceans with visible front lines and documented battles, there existed another form of conflict that developed in silence beneath the waves, where steel vessels moved without ceremony and where entire missions could disappear without immediate explanation. And it was into this submerged dimension of warfare that the USS Grunion was introduced, not as a singular anomaly, but as part of a rapidly expanding undersea strategy that was still being defined in real time by necessity rather than certainty. The submarine itself was born into a moment when naval warfare had already shifted beyond traditional expectations, and yet the full implications of that shift were still unfolding, leaving new vessels like the Grunion to operate in conditions where even doctrine was still being written through experience rather than precedent. The USS Grunion, designated SS-216, was a Gato-class fleet submarine constructed by the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, a shipyard that had become central to the United States' accelerated wartime production following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Launched on December 22, 1941, only weeks after the United States formally entered the war, the vessel was part of a generation of submarines designed for extended range, endurance, and independent operation across the vast distances of the Pacific, where supply lines stretched thin and contact with friendly forces could be sporadic or delayed. When she was officially commissioned on April 11, 1942, the submarine was already entering service at a moment when urgency defined every aspect of naval construction, and the expectations placed upon such vessels were not only operational but strategic in scope, as they were intended to disrupt enemy shipping routes while gathering intelligence across waters that were increasingly contested. The name Grunion, taken from a small fish known for its unusual behaviour along the Pacific coastline, carried an understated quality that contrasted with the immense machinery it represented, a detail that, in hindsight, seems almost symbolic of the submarine's later fate, though at the time it was simply part of the US Navy's tradition of naming submarines after marine life. Beneath that name, however, the vessel embodied the technical evolution of submarine design in the early 1940s, with a hull engineered for deep diving capability relative to earlier classes, diesel-electric propulsion systems that allowed for extended submerged travel, and improved living conditions for a crew expected to endure long patrols in isolation. These were not experimental features, but rather the emerging standard for a new generation of fleet submarines, intended to operate far from established support structures. Command of the USS Grunion was assigned to Lieutenant Commander Manat Lincoln Abell, an officer whose naval career reflected the professional trajectory of many submarine commanders of the period, shaped by interwar service and refined through rapid wartime escalation. His role was not merely administrative, but deeply operational, as submarine commanders in this era were expected to make rapid, independent decisions in environments where communication with higher command could be limited or delayed, and where tactical awareness often depended on incomplete or rapidly changing information. The weight of such responsibility was amplified by the nature of submarine warfare itself, where detection often meant vulnerability, and where the line between hunter and hunted could shift without warning. Before entering active combat operations in the Pacific Theatre, the USS Grunion underwent the standard procedures of testing and preparation, including initial trials and crew familiarization designed to ensure both mechanical reliability and operational cohesion. These early stages, while routine in structure, carried heightened significance in wartime conditions as vessels were being deployed into combat zones with minimal delay, and every system on board had to be validated under conditions that simulated the demands of extended patrols. The transition from construction to operational readiness was not merely technical, but also psychological, as crews adjusted to the confined environment of submarine life, where time, space, and external reference points were all fundamentally altered. As training progressed, the broader strategic role of Gato-class submarines became increasingly defined by necessity rather than doctrine, particularly in the Pacific, where vast ocean distances and fragmented intelligence required vessels capable of independent patrols and sustained presence in remote regions. Radio communication, while available, was often limited or delayed to maintain operational secrecy, meaning that submarines like the Grunion frequently operated under conditions of partial isolation, receiving updates intermittently and transmitting reports only when tactically appropriate. This operational silence was not accidental, but a deliberate component of submarine warfare, where detection avoidance was as critical as offensive capability. By mid-1942, the USS Grunion was positioned within this evolving framework of undersea warfare, prepared for deployment into waters that were already proving unpredictable in both environmental and military terms. The Pacific theatre was expanding rapidly, and the Aleutian Islands had begun to emerge as a strategically significant region, where shifting weather patterns, limited visibility, and contested naval activity created conditions that challenged even experienced crews. It was into this environment that the Grunion was assigned, carrying with it the expectations placed upon a new generation of submarines that were meant to extend the reach of naval power into areas where conventional surface operations were increasingly constrained. As preparations for deployment concluded, the vessel moved from structured readiness into the uncertainty of active wartime patrols, where the boundaries between mission parameters and environmental unpredictability were often indistinguishable, and where every departure carried the implicit understanding that return could not be guaranteed in any predictable form. The USS Grunion departed for operational waters where established maps could not account for what would soon unfold. The Aleutian front where silence was as dangerous as combat. Having already moved beyond the controlled conditions of its early operational readiness, the submarine slipped into waters where the familiar boundaries of navigation and certainty began to thin without warning, and what had once been a structured transition from shipyard preparation to active deployment now started to feel less like movement along defined orders and more like entry into an environment that operated under its own unstable logic, where even routine passage could become unpredictable without any visible trigger or clear mechanical cause. In this space, the ocean was no longer simply a route between destinations, but a shifting presence that absorbed reference points, distorted perception, and made distance itself feel unreliable, as if the surrounding world was constantly reconfiguring itself just beyond the limits of direct observation. What mattered in such conditions was not only the accuracy of instruments, but the stability of the assumptions behind those instruments, and in northern waters those assumptions began to lose consistency in ways that could not always be immediately distinguished from normal operational variation. Far to the north in the Pacific, the Aleutian chain stretched across a maritime corridor where storm systems formed rapidly, and visibility could collapse into near-total absence without predictable pattern or duration, and this was not a rare occurrence but a defining characteristic of the region, documented repeatedly in wartime naval records and meteorological accounts, where fog banks could settle with little warning and winds could shift direction with enough force to alter surface conditions within hours. The islands themselves, shaped by volcanic activity and geological instability, created a fragmented coastline that offered little natural protection to vessels passing through, and instead produced a landscape of water and land that seemed constantly interrupted rather than connected, forcing navigation to rely heavily on instruments that were themselves vulnerable to the same environmental pressures they were meant to interpret. Beneath the surface, temperature gradients layered the water column in ways that affected both sound and movement, creating zones where detection could weaken unexpectedly or return misleading impressions of proximity that did not match physical reality. During the same period, this remote stretch of volcanic islands had quietly taken on strategic weight within the wider Pacific conflict, particularly after the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska in 1942 drew direct attention to the northern edge of the war, transforming what had previously been considered a peripheral theatre into an active zone of military concern that required sustained attention from both naval and air forces. the Aleutians became part of a broader defensive and offensive calculus, where control of territory was not only about land itself, but about the ability to monitor and disrupt movement across the northern Pacific approaches, and yet the region remained fundamentally difficult to operate in due to its environmental volatility. Aircraft reconnaissance, surface patrols, and submarine deployments all had to contend with the same persistent limitation: that visibility could not be guaranteed long enough to maintain continuous situational awareness, and that even coordinated operations could become fragmented when environmental conditions shifted faster than communication could compensate. Within these waters, submarine operations were shaped not only by enemy presence, but also by environmental distortion that frequently interfered with sonar interpretation, navigational stability, and even the reliability of visual confirmation at periscope depth, creating a layered form of uncertainty that extended beyond tactical engagement and into the very mechanisms used to define situational awareness. Sound propagation in cold northern waters could behave unpredictably, bending or dispersing in ways that made it difficult to distinguish between actual vessel movement and false readings, while surface conditions often prevented sustained observation long enough to confirm whether a contact was real, transient, or entirely illusory. Even minor variations in depth or thermal layering could alter acoustic returns enough to change the perceived structure of the surrounding environment, meaning that interpretation depended not only on what was detected, but on how recently the system had been calibrated against shifting conditions. As patrol routes expanded into this northern corridor, individual submarines entering the region began reporting conditions in which separation between environmental interference and potential contact often could not be clearly distinguished in real time, and this ambiguity became an accepted operational reality rather than an exceptional circumstance, shaping the way crews interpreted signals, movements, and even moments of apparent stillness that might otherwise have been considered neutral. In such an environment, silence itself acquired a different meaning, no longer simply the absence of communication or sound, but a condition that could mask presence, distort expectation, or delay recognition of events until they had already progressed beyond immediate awareness. Operational reports from the region increasingly reflected this instability, not through dramatic language, but through careful notation of inconsistencies, delays in confirmation, and instances where expected correlations between observation and verification failed to fully align. It was into this environment that submarine patrols continued to advance, carrying with them the procedures and expectations of standard naval doctrine while gradually encountering conditions that did not conform neatly to those frameworks. And as each vessel moved deeper into the region, the distinction between operational difficulty and environmental obstruction began to blur in ways that were not always immediately identifiable. The accumulated effect of these conditions was not a single moment of failure, but a gradual erosion of certainty in which each new observation had to be weighed against the possibility that the environment itself was contributing to distortion. Over time, this forced a subtle shift in how patrol data was treated, with greater emphasis placed on cross-verification and delayed confirmation rather than immediate interpretation of isolated readings. Reports from the area did not always describe combat in direct terms, but instead recorded variations in interpretation, inconsistencies in readings, and moments where expected confirmation failed to appear within anticipated timeframes, leaving gaps that could not be easily resolved through existing communication channels. These gaps were not always treated as anomalies in isolation, but as part of a broader pattern emerging from the region, where the accumulation of small uncertainties began to influence how entire patrol sectors were evaluated and reassessed. In this way, the Aleutians became not just a theatre of strategic importance, but a testing ground for the limits of perception under sustained environmental pressure, where even well-established procedures required constant adjustment to remain functional. And as the USS Grunion moved further into this northern corridor, it did so within a framework where even the most routine assumptions about environment, detection, and distance were no longer stable enough to be taken for granted, first patrol into waters that rarely returned answers. With the submarine now fully embedded within the northern operational zone, the transition from environmental uncertainty to active patrol duties unfolded without any clear visual or procedural break in continuity, as wartime deployment in the North Pacific rarely allowed for ceremonial separation between preparation and execution, and vessels moving into this region often entered directly into conditions that had already begun shifting long before their arrival could be formally registered in operational logs. In practice, the act of beginning a patrol was less a distinct moment and more an extension of movement through an already unstable maritime system, where navigation, observation, and tactical readiness had to function simultaneously under conditions that did not pause to accommodate procedural clarity. The result was an operational environment in which the submarine was never fully outside preparation or fully inside engagement, but instead existed in a continuous state of monitored uncertainty that defined every subsequent action. During the initial phase of its deployment in the North Pacific Theatre, early patrol movement followed established naval procedures on paper, yet the recorded conditions in similar regions often reflected inconsistencies between planned routes and the actual stability of operational observation, particularly in areas where weather systems and oceanic variability introduced irregularities that could not always be accounted for in planning. Submarine patrol doctrine during World War II was designed around extended independent operation, but the implementation of that doctrine in the Northern Pacific required continuous adaptation, as patrol paths that appeared structured in operational briefings frequently encountered environmental disruptions that altered perception of distance, timing, and even the reliability of surface identification cues used for confirmation. What emerged from this was not a breakdown of procedure, but a subtle redefinition of procedure itself, where operational intent remained constant while the conditions required to interpret that intent became increasingly unstable. Beneath the surface layer of patrol activity, sonar interpretation during World War II submarine operations relied heavily on acoustic reflection patterns that could shift unpredictably, depending on water temperature gradients, depth, and ambient maritime noise, creating a system of detection that depended as much on environmental structure as on the equipment generating the readings. In practice, this meant that sonar returns were not treated as fixed indicators, but as evolving inputs that required continuous contextual comparison against known environmental baselines, which themselves could change as the submarine moved through different thermal layers and pressure zones. Even small variations in water density could alter how sound waves propagated, producing returns that might appear consistent at first glance, but diverge significantly when re-evaluated under changing conditions, forcing crews to treat acoustic information as provisional rather than definitive. Across Gato-class submarine deployments in the Pacific, patrol structure typically involved extended independent operations that required crews to maintain long periods of observation with limited external communication and intermittent confirmation windows, a design that reflected both the strategic demands of dispersed warfare and the technological constraints of underwater communication systems of the era. These patrols were structured around cycles of observation, silence, and reporting, where data was collected continuously, but transmitted only during carefully timed intervals that minimized exposure. As a result, the operational picture available to command structures was inherently discontinuous, built from segments of information that required later assembly, rather than real-time integration, introducing a temporal gap between what was occurring at sea and what was being understood at headquarters. As environmental interference accumulated across multiple layers of observation, distinctions between natural oceanic distortion and potential contact readings became increasingly difficult to isolate within real-time decision-making processes, especially in regions where atmospheric instability above the surface coincided with acoustic unpredictability below it, producing overlapping conditions that affected both visual and sensor-based interpretation. In such environments, even minor inconsistencies in readings could not be immediately categorized without risk of misclassification, since the same anomaly might represent either a harmless environmental artifact or a transient operational contact that could not be verified within a usable time frame. This forced crews to operate within a decision space where ambiguity was not an exception to normal procedure, but a recurring structural condition that shaped every interpretive choice. Within this operational framework, the USS Grunion's early patrol progression entered a phase where individual readings and intermittent signals could no longer be immediately categorized with consistent certainty under standard interpretive protocols, as the accumulation of environmental and acoustic variables introduced ambiguity into what would otherwise have been routine classifications of contact or absence thereof. The submarine's movement through this phase was not defined by a single event or identifiable turning point, but rather by a gradual increase in the interpretive effort required to maintain situational awareness, where each new observation had to be assessed not only for its immediate content, but for the reliability of the conditions under which it was recorded. Over time, this created an operational reality in which clarity depended less on the presence of complete data and more on the ability to construct temporary coherence from incomplete or partially obscured information. As fragments of incomplete transmissions began circulating through delayed channels of interpretation, the boundary between confirmed reporting and uncertain detection started to dissolve further into ambiguity. Intercepted signals and reports that did not align with reality. Following the progression of early patrol activity into increasingly uncertain observational conditions, the next layer of complexity emerged not from physical environment or direct contact, but from the systems used to translate experience into recorded information, where the act of communication itself became a secondary field of uncertainty layered on top of already unstable navigation and detection. In wartime submarine operations, what was known and what was officially recorded did not always exist in the same temporal space, because the transmission of information depended on carefully controlled intervals, procedural restraint, and conditions that prioritize concealment over immediacy, creating inherent gaps between action and documentation that could not always be reconciled in real time. These gaps were not anomalies in design, but structural features of how underwater warfare was conducted, particularly in the Pacific theater, where distance, secrecy, and vulnerability to interception shaped every decision regarding when and how a vessel could transmit its position or status. Over time, this separation between lived operational reality and recorded communication became one of the defining constraints of submarine warfare itself. Throughout World War II submarine operations, communication protocols were structured around strict radio discipline and limited transmission windows that prioritized concealment over continuous informational exchange between submerged vessels and command structures, meaning that submarines often operated for extended periods without confirming updates from higher authority. When communication did occur, it was typically brief, encoded, and timed to minimize exposure, which introduced additional layers of delay between the moment an event occurred at sea and the moment it was acknowledged within operational command systems. This structure ensured survivability in contested waters, but it also created a condition where information was inherently fragmented, requiring later interpretation rather than immediate validation, and where the meaning of any single transmission could shift, depending on what had already transpired during the silent intervals between messages. In effect, communication was not a continuous stream, but a series of isolated confirmations suspended across time, each dependent on the stability of what could not be transmitted. Across multiple naval theatres during the same period, delays in message transmission and a synchronous receipt of operational updates occasionally produced situations in which recorded expectations and real-time developments no longer aligned within the same temporal framework, resulting in temporary contradictions between what was believed to be happening and what was later confirmed or inferred through subsequent reports. In such cases, discrepancies were not immediately interpreted as failures of procedure because the limitations of wartime communication were well understood, but they did introduce ambiguity into operational tracking, particularly when multiple units were operating in dispersed regions under similar reporting conditions. Over time, this could result in layered records where different pieces of information, each accurate within its own context, appeared inconsistent when assembled into a single timeline. The challenge was not determining whether the information was correct, but determining which moment in time it actually represented once separated from its point of origin. Within this broader communication environment, the USS Grunion became associated with operational reporting intervals where expected positional data and subsequent interpretive assumptions did not always converge within consistent verification timelines, reflecting the broader structural limitations of submarine communication rather than any singular deviation in procedure. Like other Gato-class submarines operating in remote sectors of the Pacific, its movements were recorded through a combination of planned patrol routes, intermittent status updates, and delayed confirmations that relied on the successful transmission and reception of encoded messages under conditions that were not always stable. When those elements were placed side by side during later review, the resulting operational picture depended heavily on which fragment of information was treated as temporally authoritative, a condition that introduced interpretive flexibility into what was otherwise intended to be a precise system of record. In this sense, the record did not simply document movement, it reconstructed it after the fact under constraints that no longer reflected the original environment in which the data was produced. As individual fragments of information accumulated through separate channels of transmission, interpretation, and delayed confirmation, the resulting operational picture began to reflect overlapping inconsistencies that could not be resolved through any single point of reference, especially when environmental interference, communication delay, and procedural spacing between reports all contributed to the fragmentation of continuity. In practice, this meant that no single document or transmission could fully represent the entirety of a submarine's status at any given moment, because each layer of information was separated by time, condition, and method of collection, and therefore required contextual reconstruction rather than direct reading. This process of reconstruction became increasingly important in regions where operational stress was already elevated by environmental and navigational difficulty, as small discrepancies in timing or phrasing could produce significantly different interpretations of movement or intent. What appeared stable in isolation often shifted when placed into sequence with other incomplete records. As the USS Grunion continued its early operational cycle within this system, the accumulation of partial records and delayed transmissions created a narrative environment in which certainty depended less on isolated messages and more on the alignment of multiple incomplete sources, none of which could fully account for the others in real time. The result was not an immediate breakdown of communication, but a gradual divergence between recorded expectation and interpreted reality, where the structure of information itself began to introduce ambiguity into what had been intended as a controlled and traceable operational framework. Within such a system, even routine updates could take on disproportionate significance depending on how they aligned with previously received data, and small inconsistencies could expand into larger uncertainties when viewed through the lens of delayed synthesis. Over time, the communication record became less a reflection of continuous operational truth and more a mosaic of partially connected moments. As the final traces of communication passed through systems already strained by delay and distortion, what remained was a message sequence that no longer aligned with any established pattern of operational meaning. The final transmission that defied operational logic. By the time naval archives consolidated the fragmented communication logs from North Pacific submarine operations, attention had already shifted toward a narrow set of unresolved final entries preserved within delayed reporting chains, where the original sequence of events could only be reconstructed indirectly through partial records, decoded transmissions, and retrospective alignment of patrol expectations that were never designed to be reassembled with perfect continuity. In this archival space, the final moments of submarine communication were not treated as isolated incidents, but as endpoints within larger informational systems that depended on timing, sequencing, and contextual overlap to maintain operational coherence, meaning that even a complete transmission could lose interpretive clarity if any part of its surrounding framework remained incomplete or displaced in time. Encoded submarine transmissions during the Second World War were routinely constrained by strict brevity requirements and limited surface exposure time, forcing crews to compress operational detail into highly selective message structures that prioritized essential status updates over descriptive continuity, while also accounting for the constant risk of interception by enemy forces during transmission windows. These communications were typically encrypted and transmitted in brief intervals, often under conditions where submarines had to maintain minimal exposure above or near the surface, which introduced additional pressure to reduce message length and increase efficiency at the cost of contextual richness. As a result, naval communication systems of the era were never designed to function as continuous narrative records, but rather as fragmented operational checkpoints that required later synthesis to form a coherent timeline. Within this constrained communication framework, the USS Grunion appears in fleet documentation as part of a sequence of messages that entered command systems without immediate contextual resolution at the moment of receipt, reflecting a broader structural limitation in how submarine operations were tracked across dispersed theatres of war. The submarine's recorded presence within these systems was not unusual in itself, as many vessels operating in remote regions of the Pacific generated intermittent updates that required delayed confirmation before being fully integrated into operational assessments. However, what distinguishes the final entry associated with the USS Grunion is not its existence as a transmission, but the way in which it remained suspended within documentation layers that could not immediately reconcile its informational content with preceding or subsequent operational expectations. Examined through later reconstruction, the final transmission attributed to the USS Grunion is defined less by any singular statement contained within it than by the missing continuity required to align it with preceding operational expectations, creating a condition in which interpretation depends heavily on what is absent rather than what is present in the surviving record. In archival analysis, such gaps are not uncommon, particularly in submarine warfare records where timing delays, environmental interference, and transmission constraints could interrupt the flow of sequential reporting. But in this instance, the difficulty lies in the inability to fully restore the relational structure that would normally connect the message to a stable operational context. Without that structure, the transmission exists as a fragment of information that resists full reintegration into a linear account of events. Naval decoding procedures of the era relied on synchronized reference points drawn from earlier patrol reports, meaning that any isolated transmission could lose operational clarity if prior positional context was incomplete or delayed, and this dependency on sequential alignment was essential for interpreting submarine activity across wide operational theatres. Command systems were structured around the expectation that messages would be received within a broader chain of information, where each update could be cross-referenced against known positions, assigned patrol areas, and expected movement timelines. When that chain was disrupted or incomplete, even accurately decoded messages could become ambiguous in practical terms, as their meaning depended on contextual anchors that were no longer fully available at the moment of interpretation. Across successive archival reviews conducted in later years, the final recorded communication associated with the USS Grunion remained preserved in official documentation, yet continued to resist definitive alignment with a singular interpretive conclusion, reflecting the broader challenge of reconstructing submarine operations from partial wartime records. In such cases, historical analysis must account not only for what was transmitted, but also for the structural limitations of the systems that carried, delayed, and eventually stored those transmissions, where preservation does not always guarantee clarity. The result is a record that is complete in form but incomplete in relational meaning, where each component exists but does not fully resolve into a unified operational narrative. Search directives expanded outward from fragmented communication records into coordinated efforts aimed at locating any physical trace of the submarine across a vast and uncertain expanse of ocean. Search operations that followed a ship already erased by the sea. Naval command systems initiated structured evaluation protocols when extended submarine silence exceeded the expected communication intervals defined under wartime operational standards, triggering a shift from routine monitoring into formal assessment procedures that were designed to distinguish between temporary communication loss and sustained operational disappearance. In practice, this transition was not immediate in its conclusions, because submarine warfare doctrine during the Second World War required a careful separation between delayed transmission possibilities and confirmed loss, especially in regions where environmental interference and operational isolation could plausibly account for extended periods without contact. As a result, early-stage evaluations often remained deliberately non-definitive, relying on layered review rather than immediate classification. Standard submarine loss assessment procedures required multiple verification stages before any vessel could be formally categorized as missing within official wartime records, reflecting both the strategic uncertainty of underwater operations and the operational reality that communication delays were common across vast maritime theatres. These procedures typically involved cross-referencing scheduled patrol timelines, expected transmission windows, and any available positional data from prior confirmed messages, creating a structured but inherently time-dependent framework for determining vessel status. The system was designed to avoid premature conclusions, particularly in the Pacific Theatre, where environmental conditions and operational dispersion frequently delayed or disrupted normal reporting cycles. Search coordination grids gradually extended across designated North Pacific patrol sectors as the USS Grunion's last known operational coordinates became the central reference point for retrieval efforts, forming the initial geometric basis for all subsequent investigative movement across the region. These grids were constructed using available patrol intelligence, last confirmed transmissions, and estimated movement ranges, but they remained fundamentally constrained by the absence of continuous tracking capability for submerged vessels of the period. Without persistent real-time location data, search planning depended on probabilistic expansion rather than precise trajectory reconstruction, meaning that coverage areas widened progressively as certainty diminished over time. Environmental instability across the Aleutian maritime zone, combined with early-generation sonar limitations, significantly reduced the accuracy of long-range detection efforts during surface and subsurface searches, creating a field of operational uncertainty that affected both visual reconnaissance and acoustic interpretation. Fog density, rapidly shifting weather systems, and unpredictable sea state conditions frequently interfered with surface observation, while underwater detection systems of the era lacked the resolution necessary to reliably distinguish between geological formations, wreckage, and deep water anomalies at extended ranges. These limitations meant that even when search assets were deployed into appropriate regions, confirmation of findings required proximity that was often difficult to achieve under operational constraints. Official naval documentation preserved submarines without confirmed recovery through classification entries that maintained operational identity while leaving physical status unresolved, ensuring that vessels like the USS Grunion remained represented within record systems, even in the absence of physical verification. This method of documentation allowed command structures to maintain administrative continuity, but it also resulted in long-term archival states where certain vessels existed primarily as unresolved entries rather than confirmed outcomes. Within these records, absence itself became a recorded condition, reflecting not only operational uncertainty, but also the procedural necessity of maintaining structured accounts despite incomplete information. Extended investigative cycles continued through recalibrated patrol analyses, incorporating revised environmental data and reassessed movement projections across the broader North Pacific search region, as evolving understanding of oceanographic conditions and wartime movement patterns gradually influenced how search areas were prioritized and interpreted. These recalibrations often occurred in response to updated hydrographic knowledge or retrospective review of earlier patrol assumptions, allowing search parameters to be adjusted in ways that reflected improved, but still incomplete, understanding of the operational environment. Despite these refinements, the fundamental limitation remained unchanged. Without confirmed physical contact, each iteration of analysis still depended on extrapolation from incomplete historical data. As search efforts progressed, without conclusive physical recovery, the USS Grunion remained positioned within operational records as a vessel defined by its last confirmed communication, rather than any verified endpoint, creating a persistent gap between documented activity and physical confirmation that could not be resolved through existing wartime capabilities. Over time, this gap became less about immediate search failure and more about the structural limits of mid-century detection and recovery systems operating across vast and environmentally unstable maritime regions. The absence of definitive findings did not terminate investigative attention, but instead preserved the submarine within a continuing framework of unresolved maritime inquiry. Years of unresolved tracking gradually transformed the absence of confirmation into a recorded anomaly that remained embedded within naval archives long after active search patterns had ceased to converge. Decades later, the ocean revealed what it had been holding back. Long after the original search efforts had ceased to produce operational updates, advancements in deep-sea surveying technologies began reshaping understanding of previously uncharted or poorly documented sections of the North Pacific seabed, as modern exploration gradually extended visibility into regions that had once remained beyond the practical limits of mid-20th century detection systems. In this expanded observational landscape, the ocean floor was no longer interpreted solely through fragmented wartime estimates or indirect acoustic inference, but through increasingly precise imaging methods that allowed previously indistinct structures to be identified, measured, and catalogued with a level of clarity unavailable during the original search era. What had once been treated as empty or unresolved space in historical records slowly became a layered map of submerged terrain, where earlier assumptions about absence could now be re-evaluated under improved technological conditions. Modern oceanographic mapping systems employing high-resolution sonar and remotely operated imaging platforms have revealed structural details of the seafloor that were entirely inaccessible to mid-20th century search capabilities, fundamentally altering how long-standing maritime uncertainties were approached in later decades. These systems function through the integration of multi-angle acoustic scanning and visual confirmation tools that can operate at depths and ranges far beyond the reach of earlier surface-based search methods, allowing for the reconstruction of underwater topography in continuous detailed segments rather than isolated points of detection. In regions such as the North Pacific and Aleutian waters, where weather instability and historical operational limitations had previously obstructed sustained observation, these technological advancements created the conditions for re-examination of long-held, unresolved cases through an entirely different evidentiary framework. Among the wreck sites later identified through expanded underwater surveys in the Aleutian region was the USS Grunion, whose final resting position had remained unverified throughout decades of earlier investigative efforts, despite repeated attempts to narrow its likely operational corridor based on last known communication records and patrol expectations. The identification of the wreck site did not emerge from a single moment of discovery, but rather from a cumulative process of mapping refinement and cross-referenced analysis that gradually reduced uncertainty across a wide area of previously inconclusive search data. When the structure was eventually matched against historical submarine design specifications, its classification aligned with known characteristics of the Gato-class fleet, placing it within the documented operational lineage of mid-war Pacific submarine deployments. Analysis of the submarine's physical condition introduced new interpretive challenges, as structural damage patterns and environmental degradation offered information that both clarified and complicated earlier operational assumptions, particularly in relation to how the vessel's final state might be understood in relation to its recorded communications and last known patrol behaviour. The pressure of long-term submersion, combined with shifting seabed conditions over time, had altered aspects of the hull's presentation, yet key structural features remained identifiable enough to allow for reconstruction of its overall configuration and orientation at the time it came to rest. Rather than resolving earlier uncertainty, these observations created a new layer of interpretive complexity, where physical evidence provided confirmation of location, but not necessarily a straightforward explanation of final sequence events. Despite the recovery of tangible structural evidence, certain expected forms of operational clarity remained absent, leaving portions of the submarine's final sequence of events open to continued analytical interpretation, particularly where communication records and physical positioning could not be directly aligned into a single uninterrupted narrative. In cases where wartime records had previously suggested uncertainty, the wreck's condition neither fully confirmed nor entirely contradicted earlier interpretations, but instead introduced a parallel form of evidence that required independent contextual evaluation. This separation between documented transmission history and physical discovery created a scenario in which multiple forms of truth existed simultaneously, without fully converging into a single definitive explanation. Even with the wreck site identified and documented, the relationship between physical evidence and recorded wartime communication continued to resist full reconciliation within a single coherent explanatory framework, reflecting a broader limitation in reconstructing complex underwater loss events from fragmented historical and environmental data alone. The submarine's recovered state provided valuable insight into structural integrity, environmental impact, and long-term oceanic interaction, yet it did not eliminate the interpretive gaps left by incomplete communication sequences or delayed wartime reporting structures. Instead, it reinforced the understanding that discovery and explanation are not always equivalent outcomes, particularly in cases where multiple systems of record, technological, environmental, and procedural, fail to converge in real time. What emerged from the ocean floor was not a conclusion, but a reconstructed presence that still left the final sequence of transmitted meaning open to interpretation. The message that still resists a single explanation. In the period following the identification of the USS Grunion's wreck site, analytical attention gradually shifted away from questions of location and toward the unresolved interpretive framework surrounding its final recorded communications, as the presence of physical evidence did not eliminate the need to reconcile how earlier transmission records and later structural findings might relate to one another within a coherent historical sequence. Once the material position of the submarine had been established through deep-sea surveys, the focus of inquiry moved into a more complex domain where certainty was no longer a matter of finding an object, but of determining whether any single explanation could fully account for the conditions recorded before its loss. In this space, the wreck did not function as an endpoint of investigation, but rather as a fixed reference point around which competing interpretations continued to develop. Within standard naval analysis of submarine losses during the Second World War, mechanical failure, navigational error, and communication system breakdown remain primary categories used to evaluate cases where operational contact ceased without recovery confirmation, reflecting the practical constraints of mid-century underwater warfare and the limited diagnostic information available after a vessel failed to return. Mechanical failure scenarios typically consider propulsion disruption, ballast control malfunction, or structural compromise under operational stress, while navigational error frameworks account for cumulative positional drift in environments where visibility and external reference points are severely restricted. Communication system breakdown, meanwhile, addresses the inherent limitations of radio transmission from submerged vessels, where timing, exposure requirements, and encoding procedures could all contribute to incomplete or delayed message reception that complicates later reconstruction. Across historical assessments of North Pacific submarine operations, environmental conditions such as extreme weather variability, acoustic distortion, and underwater terrain effects have been consistently examined as potential factors influencing signal reliability and navigational accuracy, particularly in regions like the Aleutian corridor, where oceanographic complexity can alter both surface and subsurface operational conditions within short time intervals. Variations in temperature layers, current movement, and seabed topography can all affect how sound propagates underwater, creating conditions where sonar interpretation becomes dependent on contextual calibration rather than fixed response patterns. In combination with surface-level atmospheric instability, these factors introduce a level of environmental variability that must be considered whenever reconstructing submarine behavior in regions characterized by persistent meteorological and oceanographic fluctuation. When examined collectively, these interpretive models often fail to converge into a single explanatory outcome, as overlapping mechanical, environmental, and informational variables introduce contradictions that resist unified reconstruction, even when each category is individually supported by established wartime operational knowledge. The difficulty does not arise from a lack of explanatory frameworks, but from the inability of any single framework to fully account for all observed and recorded conditions without leaving residual inconsistencies elsewhere in the sequence of events. In this sense, the USS Grunion case does not sit outside existing analytical categories, but instead exists at their intersection, where each model provides partial clarity while simultaneously highlighting the limitations of the others when applied in isolation. Within naval archival systems and subsequent historical research, unresolved submarine cases are preserved not only as operational records, but also as enduring subjects of reinterpretation shaped by evolving analytical frameworks, reflecting the way historical understanding changes as new technologies, methodologies, and comparative data sets become available. These archives maintain continuity of record even when definitive conclusions cannot be established, ensuring that vessels remain represented within institutional memory, regardless of whether their final operational outcomes can be fully reconstructed. Over time, this creates a layered documentary environment in which original wartime records coexist with later analytical revisions, each contributing different levels of interpretive detail without necessarily converging into a single, authoritative narrative. Even as recovered physical evidence, transmission records, and environmental data are analysed in conjunction, the absence of a definitive causal alignment continues to define the USS Grunion case as an open interpretive structure rather than a closed historical account, where each category of evidence contributes insight without eliminating the need for further interpretation. The wreck provides material confirmation of location and condition. Communication logs provide fragmented insight into operational uncertainty, and environmental analysis provides context for navigational and detection limitations. Yet none of these elements independently resolves the full sequence of events in a way that eliminates ambiguity across all systems of understanding. As a result, the case remains situated within a broader category of maritime history, where discovery expands knowledge but does not necessarily consolidate it into a singular explanation. What remains is not a final answer, but a layered record where each attempt at explanation reveals only how many different ways the same silence can still be understood.